Good afternoon, one and all. Welcome to the forum on the IPS Post-Election Survey on GE2020. On the 10th of July, Singaporeans went to the polls. The results were that the PAP, contesting in the full set of 93 seats, was returned in 83 seats. It was returned at a level of popular vote that was, of course, to the majority, 60 at 61.2. Of course, what was notable was the fact that the leading opposition party, Workers' Party, won 10 seats in this parliament. Also, the third point that was notable is that there will now be 2 non-constituency members of parliament from a new party, the Progress Singapore Party, with 2 members there. Therefore, we now have 2 opposition parties represented in Parliament. The Institute of Policy Studies conducted a survey the day after the election in order to understand voters' attitudes and behaviors. We are here to do a deep and wide analysis of what shaped the vote on the 10th of July. With me is a member of the IPS research team, Dr. Teo Kay Key, to present the findings. She represents us, a team of 4, which includes Associate Professor Tan and Sir of the National University of Singapore, as well as Damien Wang, who is part of the IPS research team. That would be Dr. Teo Kay Key. After that, she'll be followed by a very dear and old friend of IPS, Dr. Derek da Cunha. Derek is a specialist in comparative politics. He is, more importantly, the author of a book titled Breakthrough: Roadmap for Singapore's Political Future, when he analyzed the results of the general election in 2011, which was considered a watershed election, where the Workers' Party made the breakthrough, its first breakthrough in a group representation constituency. Following Derek will be Dr. Lam Peng Er, who's Senior Research Fellow at the East Asian Institute. He is also a specialist in comparative politics in East Asia, and his special focus is on Japan as well as Singapore. He has published widely, and we're very glad that he can join us to give us his point of view on the GE in this year. And finally, we have a very, very special scholar who joins us from Taipei, Taiwan. He's the Distinguished Research Fellow of the Institute of Political Science at Academia Sinica, and he's Professor of Political Science at the National Taiwan University. Another old friend of IPS, he is the director of something called the Asian Barometer Survey, which is a regional network of scholars in 14 East Asian countries and 5 South Asian countries, tracking the views of citizens in this region. He is also the co-chair of the Executive Council of Global Barometer Surveys, and clearly he's someone who will allow us to go from what we understand about the trends in Singapore to the trends in Asia, and give us a broader context of what has taken place in Singapore in July, but also what may take place going forward. So with that quick introduction, I hope you'll join me in turning your attention to the presentation of the findings of the Institute of Policy Studies Post-Election Survey on GE 2020. Dr. Teo has 20 minutes and a lot of interesting data. We have heard the PAP spokesman give its post-mortem on the election, but what the survey presents would be ideas or indications of how the voters responded to all the parties, a range of issues, and also what they tell us about their general proclivity towards democracy. So over to Kay Key, please.
Hi, thank you, Gillian. Can we have the slides, please? Thank you. So today I'll be presenting on the results of the IPS Post-Election Survey. Next slide, please. This is the content that I'll be covering for today. So I will go very quickly to touch a little on the research background and objectives. Next slide, please. Okay, next. So the Perceptions of Policies in Singapore survey, or POPS as we call it, is an IPS survey series to take snapshots of how our stakeholders respond to changes in policy or the political environment. So the IPS team came up with questions and did the analysis using data from the field work by Degree Census, which is the survey firm that we commissioned, and the research protocol was approved by our NUS Ethics Board. Next slide. So we have actually conducted 4 waves so far of the post-election survey, which is what I'm presenting today. For the current wave, we conducted field work from 11th July to 21st of August. What is the most different for this wave compared to the previous 3 waves is that in the previous 3 waves, we conducted the collection of data only via landline. So we called them on their landline phones. This year, we did landline, and on top of that, 2 more modes, which is on mobile phone and via internet survey. So these are all recruited from the Degree Census panel of respondents. Next slide. So there were a few burning questions when we went into looking at the data. First of all, did COVID-19 matter and did management of this pandemic matter? Second, was there reversion of the upward trend for political pluralism after dipping in 2015, and is it still related to social class? Which segments might have affected the overall change in support for the PAP and WP? How important was online campaigning? And is there any difference between the different modes of collection for data collection that we did? Next slide. So we will touch a little on the methodology, how we conducted this survey. So we had 3 different modes, and so 3 different response rates. For landlines, it was a 23.6%. It is an industry standard. We had higher proportions of response rates for mobile phones and online because they were recruited from the panel. After collecting the data, we then checked all the data against national statistics for age, gender, and race, and then we weighted the complete sample for these 3 variables. Next slide. So here you'll see a comparison against the national statistics. For age, gender, and race, as I have mentioned, we have already weighted them, so they are very similar in proportions. Next. The next 2 slides will show you 4 different variables: housing type, education, income level, and occupation. Sorry, please go back to the first slide, thanks. So these 4 factors are what we call socioeconomic factors when we refer to them together, or SES. So that's how I'll talk about them later. So we have 4 different categories for housing and 5 different categories for education. If you look at the diploma and professional qualification, you'll see that the proportions are not very similar. That's because for our survey, we classified professional qualification with university, so there were some differences. Next slide, please. For monthly income, we had 4 different categories: low, which is $0 to $2,000, low middle, $2,000 to $5,000, middle, $5,000 to $7,000, and upper middle, which is $7,000 and above. For occupation, we had a service class, intermediate class, and working class. Next slide, please. Now I'll touch on the findings on key topics. The first topics I'll cover is issues. So we took respondents through a list of 15 issues, and we asked them how important each is. So they are supposed to give a rate of 1 to 5. So 1 is not important at all, and 5 is very important. Next slide will show you the ranking. So we actually presented the ranks in this manner. We have the landline, mean score, and rank. And then we combined all 3 different modes together to give you a mixed mode, mean score and rank. If you look across the 2 results, we'll see that actually the mean score and ranks are very similar for these 2 results. Next, please. Efficient government was the top concern, and it has been so since 2006, and is especially so for the service class and diploma and university education. We included the new item, government's handling of COVID-19 situation, because of the current situation, and it was important for 89% of our respondents, and particularly so for those who are older, with lower income, and with secondary or below education. Next, please. We also had three different issues that came up where we saw a marked increase in the proportions answering very important. So these are job situation, cost of living, and need for different views in Parliament. Next slide, please. So for cost of living, we saw that this was an important issue for people aged between 30 to 54, in the working and intermediate class, in the lower income groups, and diploma holders. Job situation had very similar demographics, 30 to 54 years old, lower and middle income groups, Malays and Indians, and males. Next. We see for need for different views in Parliament, there were actually different demographics. So the youngest age band, people in the service class, middle income group, and those with higher education. So there was a slight divergence of how people prioritize issues. Next, please. The next topic I'll cover is candidates' traits. So we asked respondents how important a list of 10 character traits were in shaping their voting decision. Again, they are asked to rate it from 1 to 5. Next, please. This is the ranking that we found. Again, very similar results when we have the landline and mixed mode scores. Honesty is the top trait. Next, please. We'll see that the top trait, honesty, was especially important for the service class, upper middle income bracket, people with higher education, and people living in private housing. Being a fair person mattered, especially to people who are younger and who had diploma certification. Characteristic of hardworking or being committed was especially important to Malays and Indians, and secondary to diploma holders. Next, please. The next topic is communication channels. So we asked them on the list of 11 communication platforms, again 1 to 5, on the importance of these channels. One of the items was internet. So if internet was stated very important or important, they were asked to answer a follow-up question where they had to name in an open-ended source up to 3 specific internet-based platforms. So next. This is the general ranking. So we see that this year, internet is first. It's not surprising given that we were mostly online during the election campaigns. So again, the landline and mixed mode had very similar results. Next, please. This is a representation of the people who answered the internet-based platform question. So we see that Facebook came up top. It was already top in 2015. This year it remains there. And for the mixed mode, actually a larger proportion named Facebook as one of their platforms. We also see mainstream media platforms, CNA and Straits Times, as part of this group. In 2015, Twitter was ranked 4th, but this year it dropped out. Instead, Instagram came in 4th, and likely because many political parties and candidates made use of this platform quite a lot this year. Next, please. So we found that internet was important to the same group as compared to 2011 and 15, which were the younger voters, people in the service class. And the lower the age and higher the occupational class, the more influential internet was for them. Meanwhile, TV and newspapers were still important, especially for older voters, the less educated, and people with lower income. Next, please. Because of this year, we had to move election rallies online, and it was found to be especially important for younger voters, people in the intermediate and service class, people in the middle income group, and those with post-secondary or above education. Next, please. So next topic is credibility of parties. We asked respondents to rate different parties on how credible they found it. There were many parties that contested in the elections. However, in order to prevent survey fatigue for our respondents, we chose to only asked them on 6 parties, and how we chose these parties were those who obtained the highest numerical votes in 2020. So they were asked to express agreement or disagreement to the statement, the party is a credible party. Next, please. This is the ranking based on landline and mixed modes. And we find that actually, again, not much difference between these two results, and also that the ranking is the same as how the actual number of votes were received in 2020. Next, please. So here we see the more detailed breakdowns. When we look at the PAP scores, we see that for mean score, there was a slight drop compared to 2015. Answering very strongly agree did not change very much. However, the proportion answering agree actually dropped compared to 2015, while the proportion answering neutral increased. For the WP, we saw an increase in mean score compared to 2015, with the proportion answering very strongly agree expanding for this year, and also the proportion saying disagree growing smaller this year. PSP only has 1 data point because it is a new party this year. Next, please. The next 3 parties are SDP, NSP, and People's Voice. For People's Voice, again, it is a new party, so there's only 1 data point. Next, please. We did a deeper analysis of PAP and WP results. So when we compare across age, the solid line is the results for 2020. The dotted line is for 2015. So we'll see that the proportion answering strongly agree or agree actually dropped overall across the age bands, with the largest decreases coming from those aged 40 to 49 years old. Next, please. For the WP, we see that the solid line is higher than the dotted line, and the largest increases came from those in the oldest age bands. Next, please. So here we see a comparison across ethnicity for these 2 years. The blue dots are for 2020, the red dots are for 2015, and we see that there's a general downward shift across ethnicities. Next, please. For WP, we saw a general upward shift for all ethnicities, with increases in the rating for strongly agree and agree amongst those in the smaller minority groups. Next, please. So overall, it was credible, especially with those older, with lower education and females. For the WP and PSP, they were found to be credible by people who are younger in the service class, those with secondary or above education, new or first-time voters, and males. Next, please. For the PAP, the drop in scores, other than from age and ethnicity, were for those with secondary or diploma education, the low or low middle income groups, people living in 1 to 3 room flats, and males. Next, please. For WP, the increases in proportions of people answering strongly agree or agree came from other than age and ethnicity for those in service class, post-secondary education, those who are not first-time voters, people living in 1 to 3 room flats, and females. Next, please. So we also have conducted cluster analysis. Cluster analysis is a statistical tool that we have been using historically to examine the degree of support for political pluralism in Singapore. So how we did this was to look at the answers to 5 different statements in our survey. First one, if respondents say that there is a need for checks and balances, there is a need for different views, that it is important to have elected opposition members, that the whole election system is not fair, that there is a need to change the election system, these people are grouped in the pluralist cluster. If they answer opposite to this, they are grouped in the conservative cluster. Next slide, please. So if we have an eclectic mix of views across these different responses, we put them in the swing cluster. So here we present the results for landline modes. The reason being we have done the same analysis for previous years, so we want to have a direct comparison. So, next, please. So we'll see here the breakdown of the different clusters across the years. If we look at the red pluralist triangles, we'll see that actually there has been a small expansion from 2006 to 11, and then shrinking in 2015, and this year there's been a larger proportion comparatively. For the swing voters, however, we see that actually it has expanded by a lot this year and is now more than half of the respondent group. Next, please. So we looked at the pluralist, so the proportion of pluralists across different demographic factors. So age-wise, we saw that there was highest increase in proportion for the youngest group. Next, please. We did not find any statistical significant difference across housing types. Next, please. For occupation, we found that for the service class, there was the highest increase. Next. And for income, we found that the highest increase came from the low income group. Next. Education-wise, we saw that those with post-secondary education, which means A-level, N-level, and NITEC certificates, had the largest increase in proportions. Next. So we saw that actually there was a higher proportion of pluralists in the higher socioeconomic and younger age segments. For those with larger statistical shifts towards pluralism were those who were aged 21 to 29 in the service class, with lower household income and had post-secondary education. Next. We also examined the different issues that may have made them that they have prioritized. So we see that actually conservative cluster has slightly different concerns compared to the swing because they prioritize government's handling of COVID situation and government help for the needy. While the other two looked at checks and balances and different views in Parliament. However, we do see that across all three clusters, there is a prioritizing of need for efficient government, which means that across the political spectrum in Singapore, there is a high importance attributed to efficiency in government. Next. So modality differences, we tried to compare across different modes of collection. We found that online respondents were slightly different in that they tended to have higher mean scores for most issues, candidates' characteristics, and communication channels. They were more likely to be pluralists and less likely to say that the PAP had governed well and that their lives had improved. However, no difference in the credibility scores. Next, please. This is a table that we can come back to later, but this is a complete breakdown of the different items where there was significant difference. Next. So in conclusion, we go back to our burning questions that I stated earlier. For issues, we found that political ideals were important, but the government's handling of the COVID situation was also important. The job situation and cost of living were two issues where we found significant increases and only amongst specific people who had concerns about their livelihood issues. The need for different views were deemed more important by people in the service class and the youngest age band. Next. In terms of party credibility, PAP has the highest mean score and highest proportion of those who strongly agreed with the statement. The larger drops compared to 2015 were for those who were aged between 40 to 49, also those with slightly lower education, low to low middle income, 1 to 3 room HDB dwellers, and males. For WP, there was an increase in mean scores with larger rises among seniors, and for those in the PMET group, post-secondary education and above, HDB 1 to 3 room dwellers and females. Next. Cluster analysis, for that we found that the pluralist, the trend of pluralists being younger and of higher socioeconomic status was still holds, with sharpest shifts in those with the youngest age band, service class, low monthly education, and post-secondary education. Next. Communication channels, not surprisingly, the internet became most influential, with Facebook, CNA, and Instagram being the three of the most influential channels. Next. In terms of modality differences, we did find some differences, particularly between online respondents and those who responded via landline and mobile. And these online respondents were likely to be pluralist, less likely to say that Singapore has been well governed since 2015, prioritize fairness in government policy, and turn to a wider range of communication channels, including internet, e-rallies, and television. And with that, thank you for your time. I'll pass the time on. Thank you.
Thank you, Kay Key. I hope that presentation gives our audience some background, some insights into the results of GE 2020. Let me repeat that again, that the PAP garnered 61.2% of valid votes in GE 2020. This was a swing downwards of 8.7% from 2015, where it garnered 69.9% of valid votes. On the side of the leading opposition party, Workers' Party garnered 11.2% of valid votes. It might surprise you to know it was just a shade off, 1.28% less than what it garnered in 2015, which was 12.5% of valid votes. But I believe that that is really the result also of the fact that when you look at the whole pie, there were far more opposition parties running in GE 2020. So to give us a clearer take on, or deeper take on how the parties performed in GE 2020, their strategies and the outcomes and what these portend for the future, we have Derek now, and I hope, audience, you will give him 10 minutes of your time. Meanwhile, we invite you to send us your comments and questions on Facebook Live. Feel free to type away and we'll be able to respond to your questions when we've gone through these formal presentations. So go ahead and respond as you join with us to think about what the results of 2020 meant and what our data tells us, as well as what our experts have to say about all of that. So it's over to Derek now. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Gillian. Let me just sketch out a few issues. My presentation differs greatly from that of Dr. Teo's and the IPS survey in both style and content. That presentation looked at the issue from the point of view of the voters. Mine will look at it largely from the perspective of the political parties. Though both presentations might be at a tangent to each other, they are actually quite complementary. Let me now establish some context. The first context is my contention that an increasing number of people have a Manichean view of the world, viewing things largely in terms of a struggle between the forces of good and evil. The second context relates to how political party should be viewed. Former British Prime Minister Tony Blair was characterized as a person who viewed political power as a priceless Ming vase being carried across a polished floor by a museum curator. Meaning, if you wish to attain and maintain political power, you should always adopt a cautious approach and not get bogged down by insignificant elements or those on the fringes, or you will slip and the vase will be shattered. Let me now just highlight 5 points. Point 1, GE 2020 was a good result for the Workers' Party and a bad result for the PAP. A bad result does not equate to a disaster for the PAP, as claimed by some foreign academics. The PAP secured 83 out of 93 fully elected seats, and its popular vote capped above the 60% level, as it did in GE 2011, constituting not just statistical but psychological significance. Point 2, all the fringe parties that went into GE 2020, and I do not consider the PSP to be a fringe party, by the way, all the fringe parties were not expecting to win any seats, but were banking on the possibility that there would be an implosion within the WP because of the litigation over AHTC and the fact that the WP only barely clung on to Aljunied in GE2020. So their calculations were that a WP implosion would mean NCMP seats could be picked up by them. They calculated wrongly. Point 3, the contention I make is that the majority of Singaporeans are to varying degrees socially and politically conservative in nature. Pushing this point further, we can draw a distinction between an authoritarian regime on the one hand and a significant portion of a population who display largely authoritarian traits on the other. Is the government to be ascribed 100% blame for whatever ills are afflicting Singapore, or has much of the population enabled such ills? It is noteworthy that in the wake of GE2020, many commentators ascribe 100% blame to the government for virtually everything. Point 4, the actual results of GE2020 underscore what has held true for the past 3 decades, that only a moderate alternative to the PAP, which is not too confrontational in nature, will be able to take seats away from the PAP. The WP referred to itself, as it did in GE2015, as rational, responsible, and respectable. There is no fourth R, no radical. The WP has no radical agenda, and quite right too. Even as the WP has characterized itself as rational, responsible, and respectable, a small but vocal segment of voters, largely hardcore anti-PAP voters, were well before the COVID-19 pandemic already infected with another virus, the virus of delusion. They choose not to be guided by the evidence. They work on the basis that their personal situation is more important than objective facts. As such, they create their own reality, accentuated in social media echo chambers. They attack the WP if they see that the party is not robustly opposing the PAP and not supporting those who run afoul of laws that they consider anti-democratic or socially unjust. A British parliamentary saying goes as follows: the opposition occupies the benches in front of you, but the enemy sits behind you. For the WP, the PAP is the opposition, but the real enemy constitutes a number of radicals in the hardcore anti-PAP element who are infected with the virus of delusion. One should remember that 3 decades ago, Mr. Cham Si Tong built up a politically moderate SDP only to see others in the party move it to a confrontational direction, destroying opposition chances for a generation. Already in this election, one activist claimed that Mr. Cham, when he was an MP, had been humiliated by the PAP. This was clearly an attempt to revise recent political history. This would have escaped most people's attention, but it came across as an attempt to create a false new narrative about the 1990s. If you look at the WP's GE2020 manifesto, it is the most detailed manifesto put out by all the parties. It contains such a level of detail that you can take it that if you do not find what you are looking for in it, then the WP does not support such a policy. The WP has therefore been upfront about what it supports and what it does not support. No one can claim that the WP secured 10 parliamentary seats on the basis of a false prospectus. Point 5. What is the prognosis for the PAP, the WP, and the PSP? The PAP can claw back support, at least in terms of regaining part of the popular vote it lost, but it has to address concretely the serious concerns that led some voters moving away from the party in GE2020, accentuated by the pernicious effects of the pandemic. These remedies include ensuring that wages keep up with the rising cost of living, improving job security, coming up with a viable solution to HDB lease decay, adopting measures to allow Singaporeans greater access to their CPF monies, and so on. For the WP, it might be too cliched to suggest that its ability to enlarge its parliamentary presence is only constrained by the size of its ambitions. It is not as simple as that. There are a number of factors to consider when looking at the WP's prospects at the next election. Even if the PAP makes a fight back at the national level, as it now appears to be doing, the WP would not be too adversely affected as it retains an effective localized strategy concentrated largely on the east of the island. Also, the WP's approach is to knit together a coalition of voters across most demographics. It will not attempt to put together an unrealistic coalition across the alternative parties when the strength of the parties is so uneven and the policies and approaches to opposition so different. That will merely dilute the WP's identity and erode its electoral prospects. Moving on to the PSP, the question is whether the two PSP NC MPs can return to Parliament as fully elected MPs and whether they will bring other PSP candidates with them. To answer that question, we should look at recent history for guidance. It would indicate that if you were a WP NC MP, your chances of becoming a fully elected MP are 80%. On the other hand, if you were an NC MP from another party, then your chances of returning to Parliament are severely limited. The PSP lacks branding, and with no fully elected MPs, it will be a major challenge for the party to establish a viable presence on the ground in West Coast GRC. And the possibility of the PSP establishing a tacit alliance with the WP is somewhat doubtful at this stage. After initial comments by the WP leadership of cooperating with the PSP, that early unqualified support appeared to have been dialed back somewhat when the new leader of the opposition gave his maiden speech in Parliament. The support is now more equivocal and conditional. The fact is that there are significant policy differences between the PSP and the WP, and these differences cannot be papered over. The other alternative parties, mostly fringe elements, will likely be shut out because they will be denied the oxygen of publicity. They can only rely mostly on social media. The mainstream media will likely follow what is the general convention globally, that only political parties which have a legislative presence should get media coverage. If you're talking about the maturing of Singapore's politics, that indeed should be the way forward by following established international practice. Let me leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Derek. Thank you for highlighting to us the strengths of the different parties, and in particular, the discussion on WP I felt was interesting. You said that by way of policy, they are moderate. By way of tactics, they are local. And they place priority in terms of building a coalition of citizens rather than a coalition of parties. With that, I think we'd love to give the time over to Dr. Lam Peng Er. Peng Er, give us your take on GE2020, what mattered to voters, parties, and then zoom out a little bit and tell us what you think, how this compares with other jurisdictions or countries that you understand well. Over to you, Peng Er. You have 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Gillian. And good afternoon, friends, ladies and gentlemen. Heartfelt thanks to the IPS team for inviting me and big thank you to the web audience for listening despite your busy schedule. First impressions of the survey. I think this 2020 IPS survey is really a gold mine of information. It's a snapshot of GE2020 and its aftermath. It's even more valuable if we were to compare the IPS survey of 2011, 2015, and 2020. So we should not look at it in isolation, but as a time series of almost a decade. And if we were to look at it as a time series, we can extrapolate and tease out the interesting trends in Singapore electoral politics, suggestive in the years ahead. So in a nutshell, simply put, GE2020 is a new normal election. We heard that word, new normal election for 2011 GE. So it is a continuation of a trend seen in GE2011. And with hindsight, GE2015 is actually an anomaly with the demise of founding father Lee Kuan Yew and of course the joy of bicentennial year. And the PAP did exceptionally well in GE2015. But I would say GE2015 should not be the benchmark of how we look at the performance, the appeal, the mentality of the electorate, because that's an exceptional, that's an anomaly. So it will be more useful if we were to compare 2020 with 2011. Of course, this begs the question, what is a new normal in Singapore politics? Number one, the opposition is here to stay. There were talks of opposition wipeout and so on, turned out to be so untrue. Indeed, like Gillian and Derek have said, the Workers' Party had actually made modest gains. Not only a Workers' Party, even a party like SDP, a party which is considered to be relatively radical by many Singaporeans, actually did very well. Paul Tambia obtained 46.6%. Chee Soon Juan obtained 45.2%. So I would respectfully disagree with Derek by saying that I agree with him to a large extent that, hey, Workers' Party, as a watchdog, not as a mad dog, in Singapore politics, but for SDP, it's relatively speaking left of center, and yet it did have some appeal to a significant segment of the Singapore electorate. So let's not rule that out. I think they have their niches, Workers' Party appeal to support across the board, but SDP had its supporters too. What is the other feature of this new normal? It is actually the rising importance of social media as a channel of political communication. Gone were the days where the ruling party, has a monopoly of information, mainstream media, but not anymore. So if this trend of a new normal in Singapore politics were to persist, were to unfold in the next decade or two, we can anticipate that the PAP will probably remain as a perennial party in power, but with a lower vote share and seats in parliament. The PAP may even lose its 2/3 majority and the power to change the constitution at will. And this scenario may pan out if it does not relate better to a younger, better educated, and more demanding electorate. And with generational change, the Singapore electorate will be concerned with both material and post-material values. In fact, I think that for the 2020 GE, the ruling party was caught, between two pincers. Those who have material concerns and those who have post-material aspirations. So what are these material concerns? Already mentioned by Derek: job security, housing, transportation, immigration, rising social inequality. And what are these post-material issues? Values aspirations like citizens having a louder voice in governance, greater pluralism, fairness. This come out very strongly in the IPS survey, fairness, gender and minority rights and equality, environmental issues like clean energy and climate change. So these are challenged, by the PAP. It is not just, hey, demographic change, younger voters, better educated, higher aspirations, but also bread and butter issues. So in 2020, they were caught in between, these two issues. Okay, my takeaway from the 2020 IPS surveys, because of time limitation, I'll just mention three. My first takeaway is that GE2020 will be remembered as a black swan COVID-19 election. Okay, no festival or fiscal rallies. Voters went to the polling centers with masks and gloves. And the burning question of the IPS 2020 survey is, did the management of COVID-19 matter? Did it matter? Yes, it mattered. Indeed, it mattered. But to me, the survey finding is very interesting. It's counterintuitive. Why? Even though the management of COVID-19 matters to voters, the survey suggested that voters actually ranked some issues ahead of COVID-19 management, ranked ahead of COVID-19 management. And what are they? Number one, the need for efficient government, and number two, fairness of government policy. So these two issues, there were many issues, but these two issues were ranked ahead, higher than COVID-19 management. So COVID-19 pandemic hit us bang, like a sledgehammer, but it will be a non-issue in the next general election. In the next general election, the pandemic will be over by then. But issues identified as important by voters, especially efficiency and fairness, will remain salient in the next general election. Okay, my second takeaway. This is the electorate's evaluation of the credibility of political parties. Not surprisingly, the PAP is considered to be the most credible party, but it really has no room for complacency. The next GE is likely to be even tougher for presumptive Prime Minister Heng Swee Keat and his team, in the hearts, the minds, and the wallets of Singaporeans. If we were to look at the IPS time series, 2011, 15, 20, the credibility of the Workers' Party and the Singapore Democratic Party has increased significantly. So if you can have a look at the attitudes of the voters towards these two political parties, not just the Workers' Party, but also to the smaller SDP. If the Workers' Party were to work very hard at the grassroots, at its constituencies and in Parliament, it is likely to keep Hougang SMC, Aljunied GRC, and Sengkang GRC in the next general election. And given the twin trends of demographic change, more amenable to political pluralism, and rising credibility of the Workers' Party, it is not inconceivable that the Workers' Party may win another SMC or GRC in the next GE. Yeah, I'm not clairvoyant, but I wouldn't really rule it out. So Singaporeans, voters are very performance-based. Okay, it's not just what you talk, but how you walk. So it's really up to the Workers' Party, how they perform at the grassroots. Third takeaway, this is my third takeaway because of time consideration. The issue of fairness in public policy and whether candidates and parties have empathy for fairness. I think this came up quite prominently for me, the issue of fairness. Okay, and the IPS survey captured the issue of fairness in public policy and also what they think about voters who are proxies for political parties. Interestingly, in the IPS survey, according to the ranking, what is number one? The number one most important attraction to them is honesty. Number two has to be fair. Fair candidate, fair party. And what are the other qualities ranked below? hardworking and committed, efficient, they can understand people, and so on and so forth. So what really caught my eye is that fairness was ranked quite highly, number 2. And in Singapore, the issue of fairness is also tied to the privileges of the elites and the fear that the system of governance in Singapore may not treat the non-elites fairly and equally. Okay, this is beyond the scope of my my little 10 minutes, because Party Liani, this is the talk of the town. It really boils down to the issue of elitism, privileges, and fairness. Okay, this is beyond the scope of my talk, but I will just concentrate on the issue of fairness and GE2020. I think the harbinger of this issue was a PAP candidate, Ivan Lim. He quit as a candidate after online allegations of his elitist attitude. These are allegations, his elitist attitude in the military and work. So many people coming out say that this guy, he has an attitude problem. He's elitist, right? Another issue of fairness is Resha Khan, 26 years old, I think, Workers' Party candidate in Sengkang. She's a member of parliament now. Very controversial because her Facebook post in May 2002 criticized the Singapore law enforcement authorities. What did she say? For discriminating against Singaporean citizens. And she said that rich Chinese and white people were treated differently under the law. Okay, this is actually very, very controversial. People in my generation, we think this is OB Marcus, something that she shouldn't have said. But I've spoken to some of my young colleagues. They think that many young people perceive that is so. Okay, so I think there's a generational gap between maybe the generation of me and Gillian with some of these youngsters. They belong to a generation where things are much more freewheeling, in the internet, and it's anything goes, but this is how they perceive. And not only young people, but some ethnic minorities in Singapore believe that the system is not totally fair. Okay, this is a reality. Whether you think it is right or not, it is a perception. I will read the 2020 IPS survey with a cautionary note, and the point is the Singapore system must remain fair and seem to be fair by the masses to maintain national cohesion. And public policy must be effective and fair to mitigate against rising socio-economic inequality. So rising social inequality is not peculiar to Singapore, it's across the world, because technological change, globalization, even though there's a degree of deglobalization, it's a reality, it's a hard truth, but how do we deal with it, Singapore state and society? So to the extent the ruling PAP and opposition parties can address this question, and this I think will impact on their electoral support in the next general election. Because of time factors, I think I have to be very brief. I'll just answer the question, where do we go from here? With the party politics, in Latin, quo vadis, where do we go from here? I think that's a speculation that general election 2020 has given rise to an incipient two-party system, the Western two-party system in Singapore. I very much doubt it. I think Singapore is unlikely to see a rotation of a ruling party like the United States, US, Anglo-Saxon models, and even across the causeway, Malaysia, rotation of ruling parties. I very much doubt it. What I'm going to say is a bit controversial. If you were to put a gun against my head and ask me to anticipate what is the likely party system in Singapore, it's not going to be a PAP, a monopoly of all the seats in parliament, after the Barisan Socialists walked out. I think it's more likely to see the emergence of a 1.5 party system, within the next decade or two. Okay, some of us may scratch your head. What is this guy talking about, 1.5 party system? I'll explain to you. I'm a Japan specialist. An example of a 1.5 party system was the Japanese party system between 1955 and 1993. Why 1.5 party? Why 1.5 party system in Japan? The perennial party in power was a conservative Liberal Democratic Party, the LDP. And then we have a permanent party in opposition, the Japan Socialist Party. For almost 4 decades, the Japan Socialist Party won on the average around half the seats, sometimes less, half of the seats of the ruling LDP. The opposition party will have a substantial presence in parliament, but roughly like half the seats of the LDP. But this 1.5 party system did not preclude the presence of a few smaller political parties in parliament, in the Japanese parliament, Japanese diet, like the Komeito, which is the Clean Government Party, a Buddhist party, and the Japan Communist Party. So these smaller parties, okay, because of time, I have to hasten. Japan Socialist Party, perennial party in power. So the thing is, Japan is a democracy then and now. Okay, so my question mark is, in the years ahead, next decade or two, will the Workers' Party be the other prominent party in parliament, but it will not displace the PAP? PAP's vote shares and seats will dip. Is it inconceivable that one scenario for Singapore to follow, maybe the Japanese analogy, when the PAP is like the LDP. LDP had been in power longer than the PAP since 1955, and then the Workers' Party would be like the former Japan Socialist Party with a substantial number of seats. I'll end by saying that if such a Japanese scenario would emerge, then it will be a Goldilocks outcome for a majority of voters. Why so? The PAP remaining the perennial party in power for political stability and predictability, while the Workers' Party will be a considerable opposition, providing checks and balances in parliament. And to quote James, no blank checks for the PAP to the PAP. And I end by saying that 1.5 party system does not preclude smaller parties like SDP from snatching a few seats in parliament within the next year or two. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Peng Er. Thank you for reminding us of the scenario of a 1.5 party system. It's been in existence in Japan. Doesn't make Japan any less democratic, but there's the stability there. Although in Singapore, I think you've also noted in your remarks that there is a secular or a consistent trend of support for political competition and pluralism in Singapore, especially among the young and the higher socioeconomic class. So the opposition is here to stay, and your question, or rather what you were trying to address, is the size of that representation within Parliament. Thank you for your take and for introducing to us that comparative analysis. Now it's time for Professor Chu Yun-han to take us through a master class of comparative analysis. As we introduced him, he is actually the guardian of a very large data set of voter attitudes, not just in 14 East Asian countries, but 5 South Asian countries, and has an overview of all the findings of the Barometer survey across the planet. Where does Singapore stand in terms of the rankings or the support for the concept of democracy across Asia? And what really does democracy mean to Asians? Over to you, Yun-han. You have about 10 minutes. I know you have a lot of data to share, and we beg the audience's indulgence to allow him to get through a very rich deck of slides. Over to you, Yun-han.
Thank you, Julian. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to offer you some comparative data on the basis of the cross-national survey under the auspice of Asian Barometer survey. And so we can compare Singapore with the rest of Asia. And generally speaking, I would say on many indicators, Singapore fare favorably, in our survey. Maybe, Singaporean might feel that their systems still have a lot of problems, many challenges ahead. But in terms of regional legitimacy, things like that. Actually, Singapore, compared to other Asian political systems, I would say outperform a great majority of its neighbor. Can we have the slide, please? Yeah. Next. We do have a website. The people are always welcome to browse through. We have many interesting articles and also data are downloadable. Next, please. Yeah. I just want to say one thing about Asian Barometer Survey. That is, this large-scale survey covered the half of the world population. We know we cover China, India, plus many other very populated countries. So it's a very significant cross-national comparative survey. Next. So we have conducted 5-wave survey over the last almost 20 years. Singapore joined ABS during the second wave. That's around 2005. However, the latest wave, the 5th wave, the survey in Singapore is still pending due to the COVID-19. So in a way, my presentation would be constrained a little bit because the data we have as the latest for Singapore is actually about 5 years ago. But still, we can look at, the long-term trend on the basis of data we have. Next. This is more detail of the survey schedule. Next. Yeah. Okay. We apply a very generic item about support for democracy across the region on regular basis. And on this particular indicator, we can say, well, there's a good news that is democracy is embraced by a great majority of East Asian citizens everywhere. So there's overwhelming positive support for democracy as a model of governance. You can see the data. Next, yeah. So everywhere, you get more than 75% endorsement of this statement. And in some cases, the intensity of support is very high. Like in Cambodia, about 1/3 of the respondents say, strongly agree. So actually, there's not much variation. Whether you ask people in Singapore or in Japan. Japan, which I would say, objectively speaking, is a full democracy. But in cases like Vietnam, which most experts would not recognize it as a democracy, but still, you get more than 70% population supporting this idea. Okay, so this item doesn't tell us much. Not only that, behind this rosy picture, actually, we encounter many puzzles. Next. Okay, the first puzzle is that, we found out that many Asian citizens have mixed feeling toward democracy. Okay, they don't necessarily consider democracy is always the best under all circumstances. And they don't have a great deal of trust in what we call the effectiveness of democracy, whether democracy can solve the problem the country is facing. Give you some data. Next. Say, toward this statement, democracy is always preferable to any other kind of government. Well, not, everyone agree with that, across Asia. Actually, on this particular item, Singaporeans seem to have a lot of reservation about the unequivocal support or embrace democracy as, always more preferable than any other form of government. Even in a country like Taiwan, there are a large number of people who have reservation. So only, like around less than 50%, give their unconditional support or embracement of democracy. And this happened especially to many of those emerging democracies, like the Philippines. And this, those reservations have gone up rather than going gone down, as time passes. And Mongolia, we worry a lot because, obviously there are a lot of people who become suspicious toward democracy. And so this is, something, to be reckoned with. Next. And also about what we call the efficacy of democracy. Again, there are a lot of variation, and in particular, in places like the Philippines, in Taiwan, also there's a lot of variation. Hong Kong, maybe, there are more people, believing democratic efficacy, but still, it's at most about 56%. And Singaporean also have a very mixed attitude toward this particular aspect. Next one. So this is puzzle number one. The puzzle number two is how people evaluate how democratic their country is or has been. And we use this 10-point scale, okay? And this outcome might surprise you. Next one, yeah. Next, yeah, please. Well, first of all, no political system in East Asia, that includes Southeast Asia as well, achieve really high mark. Okay, the 10-point is the perfect score. Okay, and you can take 6, like the passing grade. Okay, so most countries in region, they are hovering around this passing grade, which means that through their eyes, they think that their current system have a long way to go, before it can be accepted as a full democracy. This happened especially to quite a few young democracies like Mongolia and the Philippines. And interesting, some systems like Singapore or Thailand, they might be characterized by some political science as hybrid regime. They get slightly higher grade, but not impressive also, okay? So this is another interesting question that we try to tackle next. Yeah. And this is a long-term trend, okay? And it's basically, most countries struggling, hovering around this passing grade, like 6 point something or lower than 7. There's not that much changes, over time, except in Vietnam, as country open up more, now they understand that their country actually is less democratic than they had thought before. Next. Now, although some people might question the outcome, say, well, once you use statement, with the D words, sometimes it will generate the so-called social desirability problem. So we try something else, also, give us other kind of benchmark. Next. So we come up with the next, please. Yeah. Next slide. Yeah. So we measure what we call regime support. Okay. And this is actually a very sophisticated measurement with the 5 items. But let me just give you a gist of what we found. Next. Basically, a lot of non-democratic regimes in this region, like China and Vietnam, they actually enjoy a much higher level of popular legitimacy than democratic regime on virtually every indicator, of this particular scale. So this is quite puzzling, very puzzling. Because supposedly a lot of political scientists in the West will tell you that supposedly democratic regime should enjoy a much more robust, deep-seated regime democracy than non-democratic regime. But empirically, this is entirely not the case. Next. Give you, just some data. This is one of the questions. Thinking in general, I'm proud of our system of government. Okay, congratulations. Singaporean, at least 10 years ago, okay, and the rest of the highest support of the current political regime, okay, not the government, the political system itself, okay. And also look at, the very high score, Vietnam register, and Malaysia, and Thailand, and remember this is already after the military, coup. And look at, such a disparaging low level of regime legitimacy, in the case of Japan, Korea, Taiwan. This is, very, very shocking. Actually, a lot of my colleagues in the West, they couldn't really digest, or absorb this, a very disparaging number. But actually, in the following, I try to, offer some explanation why that has been the case. Next, okay. In the interest of time, actually, I'm going to skip most of the slide in terms of figure, but they give you a very consistent picture, across country and also over time. So I don't have to repeat that. Next, and also next, okay. And very similar picture. Next, next, yeah. This is another item. You can see Singapore also fare very favorably. Saying over the long run, our government system is capable of solving the problem our country faces. Okay, much higher than what Hong Kong would think of their own political system. Next. And among the youth under 35, the pattern is similar. Okay, it's not very different from the elder generation. Next. Also similar. Next. Next. Okay, this is a summary score. Okay, we compare 10 years ago with 5 years ago, wave 3 and wave 4. So on average, based on the scale, 5-item scale, okay, Vietnam registered the highest level of regime legitimacy, okay, and other countries, their only average score is only in the positive territory, include mainland China, Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia, and Cambodia. None of them are, I would say, perfect democracy. Maybe Indonesia better, in terms of quality of democracy. But on the other hand, countries that are widely regarded as a young democracy or even established democracy actually fall into negative territory. This is again a very puzzling finding. Next, yeah, this is among the younger generation, about the same. Okay, next. Okay. And also this is another very paradoxical. Okay, if you compare this with the Freedom House score of each country, okay, and this trend, no, this is a diagonal such that the less free country, according to Freedom House, actually enjoy higher level of regional legitimacy. Okay, so this again, just to reinforce the general point I just gave you. Next. Okay. But on the other hand, this is, I would say, temporary conclusion that at least our respondent, they are cognitively consistent. Okay, Vietnamese citizens consider their system is very democratic. Okay, and also deserve their support. And then, in stark contrast, most of third-way democracy in the region do not enjoy a deep and broad foundation of populist legitimacy. Okay. Now, I think people are interested to know why that's the case. How to explain this. Okay. In the interest of time, I just go through my remaining slide very quickly. Okay. The number one plausible answer. Okay. Next. Is that, you can say, well, this has a lot to do with indoctrination, censorship or oppression. So, you can argue that citizens in Vietnam, they are misinformed, they are indoctrinated by the government, things like that, okay? But I do think this is sounds like a cliche, you know, this is like a textbook answer to this. I would consider much more sophisticated, you know, puzzling. So this is, you know, something, you know, we should not downplay too much, but on the other hand, we shouldn't overplay this typical explanation. Otherwise, you know, we'll be very complacent. Next one. Okay. The next one, I think, you know, empirically have found a support, solid support in our data. That is performance, regime performance. Okay. Just give you some concrete data. Next one. Okay. On question, you know, how, you know, in terms of their perception, how government are responsive to the need of the people. Okay. You have to recognize that Vietnam also registered the highest on this particular item. Okay, so it's consistent. You know, if people, you know, in Vietnam who see their government has been more responsive to their need, you know, than other countries, at the same time, this political system enjoy a high degree of legitimacy. On the other hand, you know, the people in Mongolia, actually, they don't see, even though the government is democratically elected, but I don't think they are responsive. So that it's one reason, you know, why the erosion of regime legitimacy over time. Next one. Another very concrete, you know, specific. Can we go back to the previous one? Yeah, yeah. On the question of income distribution. So in Mongolia and also in Taiwan too, a great majority of people think that the income distribution in their country is very unfair and unfair. Okay, and this corresponds to a very much lower regime legitimacy, you know, according to our survey. While in Singapore, actually the perception income distribution, well, you would say on the one hand, 1/3 of the Singaporean, you know, don't think it's fair. It's actually, they think it's very unfair. But relatively speaking, you know, it's much smaller. Okay, maybe the number has gone up. Okay, in recent year, probably. You know, that's why your incumbent party suffered some backsliding support. But still, comparatively speaking, you know, on this particular indicator, Singapore is doing better. You know, although this is subjective, it's not necessarily consistent with Gini index. Next one. So this is, you know, again, give you that very, very strong linear relationship, you know. So this is a performance indicator. Okay. Then come to one more explanation, and then I will stop. Okay, I know, just one more. Okay, yeah, one more. Next. The third explanation is that actually Asian citizens expect, you know, democracy, you know, to deliver. You know, they don't conceptual democracy in the term a typical political scientist would, you know, would define it, you know, like, you know, competitive party system, regular and free, fair election, you know, freedom of expression, things like that. No, actually what we found that a great majority of Asian citizens, their understanding about democracy is good governance, is clean politics, is efficiency, is government can guarantee that the basic needs, you know, like shelter, food, clothing, they are provided for. If a system can deliver that tangible outcome, they consider this a legitimate government and also democratic government. Okay, so this is a shocking, you know, finding to a lot of mainstream political scientists. I just want to give you a final chart. Okay, next. Can we have just one more slide? One more slide. Yeah, go down all the way. Continue to go down, down, go down. Continue to go down, go down. Okay, right. Yeah, this is fine. Okay, okay. So this is my final slide. I have actually, you know, overused, you know, my time slot. See, this is what we found. okay, a great majority of Asian people, okay, define democracy in terms of good governance and social equity, not in terms of norm and procedure, nor freedom and liberty. And look at Singaporean, about almost 2/3 of Singaporean conceptualize democracy in terms of what we call the substance democracy, not procedure. Okay, and it is more so. So it has nothing to do whether this society is more advanced or more modernized. Because Singapore is probably the most modernized society in Asia. And same thing in Japan, also an established democracy, okay, modernized, but they share with Singapore, with Vietnam, with many other countries, with Taiwan too. They define democracy as, something, delivered. So the final takeaway is that if democracy no longer deliver, then people will withdraw their support for the system. I stop right here. Thank you for your patience. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Prof. Chu. That's very, very useful. And I hope Peng Er also felt that there were some themes in there that resonated with what he had said about Singapore citizens seeking the question of whether the system is fair and whether it can deliver fair and equitable outcomes for them as they go to the polls. I think that's quite important. You also highlighted how a sense of responsiveness feeds into the question of political legitimacy. At this point, we can cut straight to your questions and comments, audience, because I think there are a few that really, respond to the theme of, equity, as well as whether the regime is performing well and is actually being nudged to perform even better. Let's start with Chandra Mohan's question. Panelists, please get ready. Chandra Mohan asked, do panelists feel that the election system in Singapore is fair? Is there room for improvement compared to what is expected of a first world nation? If the PAP was in opposition today, would they accept that the current election system is fair? And I think this is the theme of a responsive governance system and a government that effectively responds to what citizens are saying. So please, anyone would like to jump in? Kay Key, you kick off.
Thank you. Thank you, Gillian. For this particular question, we did have a similar survey item where we asked people how much do they think that there is a need to change the election system. So when we compare across the different clusters, where the conservatives, the swing, and the pluralists, we found that actually people who were in the conservative cluster were in the most agreement with the statement that there is no need to change the election system. There was much less support by the pluralists. For swing, I think there's very similar proportions compared to the conservative cluster. For the pluralist cluster, however, much fewer people agreed that there is no need to change the election system. So there is some ideas about the election system and how, whether it's good or it's bad and whether it needs improvement.
Okay, so over to the other panelists. I suppose an election is the way in which voters can send strong signals to parties and to one another as to what they want in terms of policy and political system. So Derek, Peng Er, Yun-han, anything you'd like to say in terms of changes to the election system or the level of responsiveness of the regime in Singapore?
Maybe I can say something, Gillian, on this particular point. In my opinion, the elections in Singapore are free, but not necessarily fair if you look at the weeds itself, in the sense that we do have an elections department, which is part of the Prime Minister's office. And then we also have an electoral boundaries review committee, part of the same setup. Now, I have no problem with boundaries being redrawn and all that kind of thing. But if boundaries are going to be redrawn ahead of elections, I think to have a very minimum level of fairness, they should be withdrawn.
Redrawn.
A year. Yeah, I mean, redrawn a year before the general election. So 12 months before the general election, the boundaries can be redrawn so that all parties have a fair shot in cultivating the ground of the new constituencies as a result of the redrawn boundaries. I think this is a particular issue that a lot of the alternative parties have faced. But you know, what is fair and what is not fair is also quite subjective. I would say that all the alternative parties are given, you know, a lousy set of cards to play in the elections. But how is it that the WP is able to convert its lousy hand into a winning hand in some respects? So I wouldn't put too much great store on, you know, to the extent to which elections are unfair. But the other point I want to raise is that, you know, in Singapore we have the first past the post system, and in first past the post is a very simple concept. Either you win by 1 vote or you lose. Now, if you win by 1 vote, that is a good result. Anything that is less than a win, whether it's 44%, 46%, in my point of view, from my point of view, is not a good result, because that is the first past the post system. If you're talking about a system of proportional representation, yes, all the percentages then matter quite a bit. You can, you know, can get 35%, 40%, 45%, and you will get some representation.
Okay, let me stop you quickly and ask you how you would link that to local loyalties and local support and local identities. Very quickly.
What do you mean in terms of local support and local identities?
If you were to transform into a proportional representation system,
no, this is what
local loyalties and identities.
This is what I'm saying. I'm not advocating for Singapore to have a proportional representation system, because around the world you have very different forms of proportional representation. You want the most liberal one, you go to Israel, where you only need 2.5% of the vote nationally, and you get 4 represented MPs in the Knesset. Okay, so that is the most liberal system. So I'm not.
Well, let me pass the time over to Peng Er and see whether he has a response to Chandra Mohan's question as well. Yun-han, if you have any thoughts on any reforms that you want to put forward. Peng Er, so unmute yourself, please.
Yeah, I think Mr. Chandra Mohan asked a question about fairness, perception of fairness, and
are there any reforms to the election system that you would want to see? Is there any room for improvement?
I think personally, I think an independent electoral commission would be desirable.
Okay, next.
Okay, and one are the criticisms that our electoral system is less than fair and less than perfect, okay, over the years. Criticisms include gerrymandering, okay, gerrymandering. Certain constituencies like Chu Chiat disappeared. If we can go back to very closely fought GRC like UNOS, GRC, Cheng San, they disappeared. Okay, these are the usual criticisms against the ruling party. But what is even more infuriating to many citizens who have a sense of fairness is the practices of the ruling party in the past years. I think the unfairness, I think, has been less blatant. But previously, in the eyes of many Singaporeans, it was very, very blatant and beyond the pale. Okay, I give you some examples. Linking voting for the ruling regime with HDB upgrading. Okay, if you don't vote for me, you'll be served last in your estate upgrading,
So
your lift upgrading, and so on. Tying your vote using taxpayers' money to tie it to how you vote for the regime, you know?
Yeah.
And even things like, hey, you stay in vote Potong Pasir. If you vote for PAP, we will open the MRT station earlier for you guys. But if you vote for Chiam Sitong, we're going to hold it back because the numbers of residents in Potong Pasir do not necessarily justify the cost of opening the station. But this is really, really discriminatory. And I wonder why Singaporeans did not take to the courts, say that this is unconstitutional. Okay, why? But because Singaporeans are also taxpayers. Singaporeans are taxpayers, and male Singaporeans like me and those after me, we serve national service. We fight for the country. We put on a uniform. So the question mark.
So the question mark is that things have changed. How have they changed?
So this is an issue of fairness. I think the system have been less blatantly so, but my qualification is even in the good US of A. Okay, the word gerrymandering came from the United States. It didn't come from Indonesia or Malaysia or Singapore, but from the United States. But I think we can, as Singapore develop, as we mature as a democracy, I think we can be a better democracy to be less blatantly unfair. Because I think fairness, a sense of fairness is very, very important. Okay, especially in public. You look at your survey, IPS survey, fairness in public policy. Okay, and I would argue it is blatantly unfair if you put an opposition constituency at the back of the line, okay, in terms of public services. Okay, thank you.
Chu Yun-han, in your last slide, you actually disaggregated the issue of norms and rules from social equity. Can you just help us to understand what is the distinction, the procedural and the substantive?
In my slide, the social equity items refer to like job security, like whether government provides a social safety net, and also whether the basic needs, are provided for. So these are all tangible, very tangible, deliverable, coming from the system. Let me add one comment on the free and fair election. Election system is obviously a very important institutional design for any democracy. And I agree with Derek that you have to be very cautious in terms of reforming the system. The first past the post, obviously, it distorts proportionality. We all know that. But on the other hand, it has the tendency to try to foster a clear-cut popular mandate. And usually it award mainstream candidate rather than the extreme radical agenda. So Singapore is a multiracial society. If you adopt PR, proportional representation, it might reinforce the racial cleavage. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, something you have to reckon with. But I think you can still improve the system on the margin. Like the government should provide more subsidy to the opposition party. The candidates should get more subsidy, from the public sector. Things like that. Media coverage is no longer that important an issue because the prevalence of social media. So now, due to the social media, the penetration, so the opposition can also enjoy some kind of playing field.
Thank you, Prof. Chu. I think in your final slide, you did show that about a fifth of your respondents did sort of prioritize norms and procedures. So clearly this is something that's important. I thank Peng Er and Derek and Kay Key for also responding to Chandra Mohan's question. But in addition to the electoral system, in order to ensure that the signaling is effective, Faith Leong has asked another question on building a responsive governance system. She says, a way to know the exact complaints of the people is to have a robust feedback system that goes directly to a higher independent office, ensuring anonymity for whistleblowers. Civil servants need to give constructive feedback and so on, so that they have, civil servants need to be able to, I think, receive feedback, I suppose. So is there anything else you'd like to say about between elections? What more can not just the civil service, since we're talking about political parties, what else can political parties do to ensure that they are channels for expression of concerns, of issues and interests from the ground to a national platform? Anyone?
Maybe I can just jump in here and say a few words on this, Gillian. Some people have claimed that after GE2020, there has been a significant change in political culture in Singapore. I really do not see that. Okay. The fact of the matter is that one indication of a change in political culture would be if the government did away with government parliamentary committees, GPCs, all right, which are all PAP sort of organized committees in Parliament, and replace them with what you have in the Westminster system, which is select committees that mirror all the ministries out there. And the composition of the select committees would be drawn from across Parliament, which would be PAP MPs, WP MPs, and even the PSP and CMPs. And the select committees would, like the Select Committee on Deliberate Online Falsehoods, they will regularly hold hearings in public. Okay. and invite expert witnesses to give their input. The importance of select committees is that they can provide direct input to policy making. And that I will tell you, you will have participatory democracy throughout the year instead of what we have now, which is only once every 4 or 5 years.
Okay. I believe that is the proposal of the leader of the opposition, Mr. Pritam Singh, Secretary General, whose party has 10 members in the House. I think that's how he'd like to structure his activities, and he'll have to persuade the Speaker of Parliament to do that. So thank you for reminding us of that. Peng Er, any thoughts? Faith has said, is there a need for government to find out in greater detail actual concerns on the ground? What can the political parties do in addition to what Derek's mentioned?
I think the ruling party, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, did a very good thing by institutionalizing the role of the leader of the opposition, okay, to recognize the office of leader of the opposition, and in a very modest way provided him with a very, very, very modest as a first step, research assistance. I think all those are quite symbolic. I think Pritam Singh needs more research assistance for public policy research and so on. That's pitifully few, but it's a right step. It is a step in the right direction. I think it's really good. And I think we should actually give credit when credit is due. Okay, but critics will say, oh, because the ruling party have been, as a result of the results of GE2020, they have to recognize reality, and then they basically recognize what has been done in the Westminster system. But the fact is, that's a very, very good move. And I will second Derek's suggestions that we have some committee. He called it select committees. Because if I look at Japan have subcommittees, special committees for different things like foreign affairs, budget, and so on. And the opposition parties are also represented in these subcommittees. And the subcommittees will have a very fierce debate, and sometimes the ruling party and the opposition parties may actually forge a consensus in the subcommittees, and when it is forwarded to the Diet, which is the Japanese parliament, legislation passed very smoothly and very quickly. In fact, a majority of legislation in Japan are passed by consensus. The ruling party will give certain, they'll take into considerations of the opposition parties, and then that will ensure the smooth passage of legislation. But much of it is actually done at the subcommittees. This is so we should not be too hung up about mimicking or aping the West, but actually you look at other systems in Japan, in Taiwan, and Korea, they do have subcommittees and special committees. And this is something which we can adopt as we mature as a democracy in Singapore. Thank you.
I believe there are steps taken in that direction, and you mentioned Yun-han subsidies for the opposition, and I think that it was announced that there will indeed be far more support for the leader of the opposition, which was also mentioned by Peng Er. Any further thoughts? Otherwise, I'll move on to the next comment or question because we're running out of time.
I just add a quick note here. Actually, improving your feedback mechanism, actually, it sounds a little bit outdated nowadays. Nowadays, actually, government or the party can act proactively. You have big data, you have AI, and the government owns so much information about everything. Okay, so a very intelligent organization or agency, they can actually, have a very firm grasp, okay, on what's going on and what's the people's sentiment, what's emerging, the concern and needs. So I think to make government agency much more intelligent and to make the best use of those big data, it's very important.
And can our other political parties adopt such measures?
Well, yes, if the government also make them available, to make a lot of data, publicly and free accessible.
All right. Thank you so much.
And can also, tap into this big reservoir. Yeah.
Okay. So let me throw you a few more questions, not so much about the system anymore, but about ideals and interests. As a way to wrap up the forum. I'm going to read a few comments out, and then I'll invite the panelists to just respond to the comments or questions that they'd like to take up. Okay, first question by Sui Ting Lo. How does the rising level of diverse views in politics affect Singapore? How will it affect Singapore going forward? By Sarah Ang, do you think the post-materialist divide in Singapore politics is likely to persist? The balance between materialist orientation and post-materialism, and how does the pandemic affect that? So does it weigh far more heavily on the materialist concerns, would it be therefore necessary to suspend political competition and pluralism in order to address those materialist concerns? Then another question, I believe, Peng Er, you responded to this in large part, but perhaps other panelists might like to take it on. What would the trend of the PAP losing or seeing a downward shift or slide in the valid votes secured lead to a possible change in government after the next two general elections? That is a question posed by Syed Al-Samad. Finally, to the last two ideas. First one is on media. I know, Yun-han, you had mentioned that media is now free because you read it on the internet. It's a boon and a bane. But the question posed by Ng Swa Keong is, media does play a pivotal role in the election. How does Singapore compare in the international arena in terms of the freedom of expression on media? And the final one is, I think, let me see, it's more a technical methodological question about survey results and how the Asian Barometer surveys were collected. Perhaps that can be found on the Asian Barometer website. So perhaps Ng Swah Keong, you could look that up there. So I would move to the last one. If anyone wants to pick this up, it's back to the election system and the electoral system, I would say. Would it be far more fair if we take away the GRC system and institute a strictly SMC system? And I think the Singaporeans will be far more fair with what this refers to. So with that, it's a huge set of questions and comments, and I just invite perhaps the panelists to speak in reverse order. So perhaps Yun-han, Prof. Chu, would you like to respond to any of those comments and questions and give us your final thoughts before we wrap?
Yes. Social media obviously play increasingly a very important role as a source of information, and also as a place where people, they identify other people with on the same wavelength. Okay. Right. It's a wonderful device, so for mobilization and also for minority underprivileged group, they can do self-cast, rather than depend on the mainstream broadcast agency. But also at the same time, people identify a lot of problems come with social media, the echo chamber, what they call digital tribalism. In the end, it reinforce prejudice and bias. Because people hang around with like-minded people, reinforce each other. It undermines the traditional role the mass media play. Mass media play a gatekeeping role, and also try to foster kind of mainstream view and impose certain mainstream basic value standard. Okay, so I think that's still important. All right. So make the mainstream media, more balanced, more professional. I think still a very important task. Right. Don't think that social media, can play magic. Right.
Thank you, Prof. Chu. We have indicators on the use of communication channels. For those for whom internet was important, you had Facebook as #1, but you actually also had Channel News Asia on its online platforms as second ranking in terms of importance. So that's quite interesting. It's mass media, but online. And to Chu Yun-han's point, it's a call to balance up the role of social media with the best of journalistic qualities to reinforce a strong and healthy democracy. Thank you, Prof. Chu. Over to Peng Er. Closing thoughts, please.
Yes, very quickly, because of time pressure. GRC.
Sorry.
Yeah, I don't think we should just chop and change and chop, I think, but we can actually fine tune the GRC system. Instead of having 5 or 6 member GRCs, I think we should reduce it to 4. Okay, so this is a mechanism. Don't forget the original intent is to ensure ethnic minority representation. Of course, certain supporters of the opposition will criticize the GRC as a ploy, to make it difficult for the opposition parties to actually organize a team of 4 or 5 or 6. But as proven by the Workers' Party in Aljunied and Sengkang, that's not necessarily so, Instead of winning 1 seat, they can win 4 or 5 seats at one go. So now the GRC is a double-edged sword. It can cut both ways. So my suggestion is, I would humbly suggest, reduce the 5-member GRC to 4 GRCs and have more single-member constituencies, so we can have a mix, greater diversity and so on. One thing I hope that we have to think, how do we ensure more representation? Women, because we always think about in terms of Malay, Indians, and so on. We have to think about greater representation, for women to have greater voice in Singapore, in Parliament. I think that's important.
Thank you.
Media, very quickly, I don't think we have reached, in the 21st century, I think Channel News Asia, Straits Times, are still very useful sources of information, interpretation, and so on. But I don't really think that they significantly, socialize, condition the views of readers anymore. The Straits Times, they know their readership is actually very diverse, and you can actually see when you read Cao Bao or Straits Times, it actually caters to a diversity of views. No? I think it's not so blatantly pro-regime. It is more pluralistic now, and the Straits Times, I think, over the years had actually reflected the diversity of the Singapore readership. Materialism, post-materialism, what is the balance? The reality check is that the country with the largest number of Greens, Le Grennen, that's the name of the Green Party in Germany. And it's not Germany, but in places like France and Western Europe, those who subscribe to post-materialism and those post-materialists who support post-materialist parties like the Green parties, they are a minority in their political systems. Okay, they have grown from 3%, 5% to 10 to 15, and in local elections even as much as 20, and they may even form a local coalition partners. The Greens may even capture like a mayorship, or they form the local governance in different regions in Western Europe. Okay, but very often in coalition. But the bottom line is, I think across all political systems, the bottom line is still materialism. The issues of survival, jobs, housing, transport. We cannot run away with that. Now, so it's never exclusive. Is it materialism or post-materialism? That said, I think we are talking about trends, and the trend is that post-materialism had risen. Right? In Western Europe, since the end of the Second World War, over the decades, it had grown. In Singapore, I think it will grow more, and it's also tied with the issue of identity. So many youngsters, better educated, better travel, more idealistic, is aspirational. For materialism is about Maslow's hierarchy of needs is about survival, but post-materialism is very often aspirational. You want to do something about environment and so on.
Yes, thank you so much, Pena. And I think in our survey, we found that those who are now in the pluralist box included both people who are of that higher socio-economic class, which we can imagine would be concerned about post-materialist values, but also in 2020, very many at the lower end of the socio-economic class. So even when the materialist values are expressed, and rightly so, because it is, COVID with acute economic strain, this translates to support for a different voice from the incumbent. But thank you, Pena, for those thoughts. And over to Derek very quickly, please.
Okay, on the point of
I'm so sorry about the time crunch.
On the point of the GRC, my view on it remains from the first book I did on the general election, or the 1997 general election. That is to say that the GRC is still a single-edged sword in favor of the ruling party, because a GRC is large enough that the sample size tends to, mimic the popular vote nationally. So that will always be the case. And there will always be outliers, of course. So I would be surprised if the PAP makes too many modifications and tweaks to the current system now. On the point of diversity of views, I think that is quite a strawman argument that has been thrown up. I know that IPS put it in a survey and all this, and members of the ruling party have suggested that that was one of the reasons why Singaporeans appear to have a greater clamor for non-PAP voices. I don't think it's related to such an abstract issue. In this country, material issues are still very paramount, and they were accentuated during the pandemic. But now, can I just quickly just touch on a few points to just tidy up this entire discussion? One is that we should remember what Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said in GE 2011. He said that, you know, the voters of Aljunied will have 5 years to repent. Well, after 9 years, they have not repented. Second point is that, you know, some have said that the PAP cannot survive without Mr. Lee Kuan Yew or Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's legacy. Let us remember one thing, that in GE 2020, the PAP did not campaign on Lee Kuan Yew's legacy. And in fact, I think this was deliberate because it might have gone down pretty badly among a segment of voters, because their only memory was what he said about HDB prices continuing to go up if the economy continues to improve. So the only person that actually campaigned on Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's legacy was Mr. Lee Hsien Yang, but that he didn't do very well on that point for himself and his party, the PSP. The third point I want to mention very quickly is that fame is very ephemeral. We have internet sensations among politicians. We had that in GE 2011, Mr. Chen Shamao and Ms. Nicole Seah. But we have seen that, you know, there are limitations to that fame. In GE 2020, Jamus Lim was both the internet and mainstream media sensation. But I will say that he is a far more substantive figure intellectually. He is actually an acquaintance because he and I overlapped as researchers at ICES for a short period of time. And the last point I want to make is that, you know, in elections, you have to invest in yourself, invest in your party, invest in the process. I saw a lot of people, you know, commenting once the elections department released figures on election spending by the various parties that, oh, the PAP spends so much and all this. And they were sort of mocking that particular approach. I think they've got it all wrong. You have to view elections as akin to fighting a military engagement, meaning to say that you throw in all the resources you can up to the limits that you are allowed to do so. In this election, it was $4 per voter, and you should spend as much as you can because your objective is to win. That is the only reason that you should stand for election, to win, and nothing more, and nothing less than that. That's all I would like to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Derek. Kay Key, final word or two before we wrap. It's 6 o'clock.
Okay, I'll make it very quick. So in terms of the materialist, post-materialist divide, I think for post-materialists in Singapore, it's probably only and views in Parliament that actually is taking more shape within the electorate. So the pandemic definitely has accentuated this divide, because we see there are people who are more secure about the situation and people who are less, and that actually changes their priorities for this time. So in that sense, we do see that there is this kind of divide, and whether it persists really depends on whether society and the policies help to shape and level certain divides that can be leveled. So with that, I think I'll leave Gillian to wrap up the whole panel.
Thank you. Very quick one on the GRCs. I think that, you know, the 6-member GRCs are a relic of the past. I think that over the last elections, it's been stated that the Prime Minister wants to see the average size of GRCs lowered, and to Peng Er's point, closer to the proportion of representation of minorities vis-a-vis majorities. Well, thank you, audience, for staying with us. You've been very generous with your time, but also please join me in thanking our panelists, Dr. Derek da Cunha, Dr. Lam Peng Er, and distinguished Professor Chu Yun-han for joining us. From the IPS research team, we just thank you for your attention, and we'd like to highlight to you that the next forum in this post-GE 2020 series will be held next Thursday on the 8th of October at 4 o'clock, and it'll do a deep dive into the use of media, which we've discussed this evening. Then we will end the series on the 22nd of October, speaking to representatives of 3 parties. Derek, you mentioned, and Peng Er, you mentioned that the focus is usually primarily on the parties that are in parliament. So we're going to be guilty of doing the same. We will have 3 parties represented: the People's Action Party, the Workers' Party, and also the Progress Singapore Party. So stay tuned to us, please. Final note, all the information that we have shared from the data will be found on the web page, the relevant event web page on the IPS website. And it will also be accompanied by a text document, the executive summary for our findings of the IPS Post-Election Survey GE2020. Thank you for your time and have a pleasant evening.